Okay, so is my voice better now? I'm getting some messages that it is breaking. Now we'll cover these zoonoses as I was just talking about: Bacillus, Yersinia, Brucella, Francisella, and Pasteurella. We'll talk about individually about the epidemiology of the diseases that are caused by these zoonoses, the pathogenesis, clinical manifestations, laboratory diagnosis, and we'll also discuss a bit about the treatment. Okay, so please be attentive in this session. Starting with the genus Bacillus. Now, the word Bacillus has got two connotations, and you should not have any confusion with regard to this. Bacillus is a word that we use which means a rod-shaped bacterium. The other meaning of the word Bacillus actually is a name. Okay, so this Bacillus that we are talking about is the name of the genus, and the other meaning of the Bacillus is rod-shaped. Okay, so obviously, if the name of this genus is Bacillus, it has to be a Bacillus. Okay, so I hope you get the point. So let's begin with Bacillus as a genus. All organisms which belong to this category or this genus Bacillus are gram-positive bacilli. All of these are aerobes or facultative anaerobes, and they're all spore-forming. So it is a very important spore-forming bacterium that we are discussing. Another very important spore-forming bacterium, but it is a gram-positive bacillus again, but it is anaerobe, is Clostridium. So probably it would have been covered or will be covered in due course. So one is an anaerobe spore-forming, the other one is an aerobe spore-forming. So Bacillus is aerobe spore-forming, whereas Clostridium you'll learn later on, if not yet covered, is a gram-positive bacillus, which is anaerobe and spore-forming. Most of the species of Bacillus are motile, but the very important exception to this rule is Bacillus anthracis. The most important species within this Bacillus is actually non-motile. Okay, while most of the other Bacillus species are motile. Most of the others are motile. Okay. Most Bacillus species are non-pathogenic and they are normally found in soil, air, water. However, there are some which are associated with disease in humans that we need to know, and that's what we're going to cover now. That is Bacillus anthracis and Bacillus cereus. So these are the two important species we're going to cover one by one. Okay. Starting with Bacillus anthracis, it is gram-positive bacillus, as I had mentioned earlier. It's the largest pathogenic bacterium causing disease in humans. In terms of its size, it is the largest pathogenic bacterium. There are a lot of exceptions associated with Bacillus anthracis. Historically, it is an extremely important bacterium. We'll learn about this. The size of the bacterium ranges from anywhere about 1 to 1.5 micrometer in width to length as long as about 8 micrometer. As I said earlier, it is spore-forming. A lot of historical firsts are associated with Bacillus anthracis, and it is not a coincidence. Simply because it is the largest bacterium, hence it was very easy to see under the primitive microscopes that were available earlier. And it's no coincidence that a lot of discoveries that we made in the field of clinical microbiology were related to this bacterium. So the first ever Koch's postulates, they were fulfilled by Robert Koch on Bacillus anthracis, and that's how we proved that Bacillus anthracis is the cause of the disease anthrax. So the first pathogenic bacterium for which Koch's postulates were fulfilled. Please remember, first bacterial vaccine that was developed was for this particular disease by Louis Pasteur. If you talk about the first vaccine ever, that is actually a smallpox vaccine, in which we used cowpox as the vaccine, but that was for a viral agent. That was by Edward Jenner. But if you talk about the first bacterial vaccine, first vaccine, if somebody asks, was which one? This was smallpox vaccination by using cowpox virus. But if the question is slightly tweaked, then if you ask first bacterial vaccine, then definitely you will say anthrax. It was the first pathogenic bacterium to be seen under the microscope by Polander, and first bacterium in which spores were discovered for the first time. We did not know again by Robert Koch, the father of bacteriology. First serological test to be developed for any infectious disease. So this was again no prizes for guessing anthrax. And this test is an obsolete test, but you need to know historically. It's called as Ascoli's thermoprecipitant test. So historically, you would realize that it is such an important bacterium. A lot of firsts actually are associated with this bacterium. A lot of important groundwork in bacteriology actually was done for Bacillus anthracis, which actually opened avenues for studying other bacteria. So if you don't like microbiology and particularly bacteriology, this is the bacterium you should be hating the most, because this was the one which actually opened the floodgates. Next, let's talk about the virulence factors by which Bacillus anthracis is able to cause disease. There are two types of virulence factor it produces, without which it will not be capable to cause disease. One is capsule, the other one is a toxin. Capsule is again a very unusual feature. It's a very important bacterium which produces a polypeptide capsule. Very, very few bacteria in the whole of microbiology, you'll find in the whole of bacteriology, you'll find bacteria produce polypeptide capsule. This is one of them. The second one also I'm going to discuss today itself. Okay, so it's a polypeptide capsule, and this polypeptide capsule is made up of a polymer of dextroisomer of glutamate. So it's a poly-D-glutamate capsule. This again is a question that you get in your exams, particularly. Prakhar, you're absolutely right. Yersinia is another one. So Bacillus anthracis is the one that we're talking to discuss just a few moments from now, also produces a polypeptide capsule. So it's a poly-D-glutamate bacteria in addition to levoisomers. So poly-D-glutamate capsule, and it is anti-phagocytic virulence property. Toxin is again a very unique toxin. We'll talk about in detail about the toxic, the activity of. It has got three components. One of them is called as protective antigen, the other one is called as edema factor, and the third one is called as a lethal factor. And how it acts, we'll discuss. It's very unusual again. Okay. So let's talk about the toxin first and how it acts. The protective antigen is the one which binds to the receptor which is present on the host cell. Now, before it binds to the receptor on the host, to bind either with factor or the lethal factor. One protective antigen molecule can either bind with one lethal factor. It cannot bind with both together. Edema factor, the toxin, the holotoxin is protective antigen bind. Instead, antigen binds to the surface of the cell surface receptor, through which it enters and delivers the active component, either the edema toxin or the lethal toxin, within the cell to act and damage the cell. The antibody, if it is formed against the protective antigen, it does not allow the protective antigen to bind to its receptor, hence neutralizes the action of the toxin. And that's why this component of the toxin is called as protective antigen, because the antibody against the protective antigen is protective. And that's why the name was given to it, protective antigen. So I hope the whole concept is clear to you. Now, edema toxin, the edema factor, once it enters the cell, it has itself got an adenylate cyclase activity. So it activates adenylate cyclase enzyme, adenylate cyclase activity, and because of which it is responsible for accumulation of fluid at the site of infection and leads to edema. And that's why the name of the toxin is, no prizes for guessing, edema toxin. So this adenylate cyclase converts ATP into cyclic AMP. This leads to accumulation of the fluid inside the cell, and this leads to the edema or swelling of the area where the infection is occurring. Lethal toxin, on the other hand, inhibits, once it enters the cell, it inhibits protein kinase, and this inhibits the intracellular signaling within the host cell, and this leads to the death of the cell. So that's the mechanism of action of both edema toxin and lethal toxin. So this is just to show you in the form of a diagram. So this is a protective antigen, the binding component of the holotoxin, and this is the lethal factor and the edema factor. If the lethal factor binds to the protective antigen, the whole toxin is called as a lethal toxin. If edema factor binds to protective antigen, the whole toxin is then referred to as the edema toxin. And if you form antibody, and this protective antigen then binds to the cell surface receptor, it's not been shown over here, and then it leads to the entry of edema factor, the lethal factor, and thereby damages the cell. If you form antibodies against protective antigen, the protective antigen cannot bind to its receptor. And because it cannot bind to the receptor, it cannot actually make the edema factor or the leaky factor enter inside the cell. And that's why these antibodies are neutralizing antibodies. And the protective antigen is called as protective antigen. So antibodies against edema factor and lethal factor are not protective. Antibodies against protective antigen are protective. Okay. So I hope you've got this point well covered. Now, let's talk about the pathogenesis of anthrax. It's a highly dreaded disease. In fact, the organism can also be used as a bioterrorist agent. We'll touch upon that a bit later. The infective stage of the organism is spores. Spores are found everywhere, particularly in the soil. These spores, they germinate into the vegetative cells, and the vegetative cells, that is the growing bacterium or a multiplying bacterium, elaborates its capsule and toxin. Capsule is antiphagocytic, so it does not allow the bacterium to be eaten up by macrophages. And the toxin obviously causes the local and systemic damage of the body. Okay, the bacteria multiplies initially locally at the site of the infection, but thereafter it quickly invades into the organs and it gets disseminated into the bloodstream. Okay. As is obvious, we are covering zoonotic infection as a major theme right now. So, zoonotic infections, including anthrax. The disease particularly is occurring in herbivorous animals, particularly cattle, sheep, and goat. So it is primarily a disease of farm animals, which are grazing animals like sheep, goat, and cattle. And while these animals are grazing, they might end up ingesting the spores in the soil at the time of while they are grazing. And then it leads to the disease in these animals. The bloody black fluid may be produced upon infection, and that's why the name anthrax actually was given to it. Anthrax means actually coal. So if you remember in your younger days, you were taught about different types of coals. You had one type of coal which is called as an anthracite. So anthrax actually is the other name for coal. So black colored fluid or bloody fluid which is oozing out, because of which it is referred to as anthrax as a disease. Now let's talk about the human disease. We are not really much bothered about the animal disease, we are really more bothered about the human disease. So the human infection can occur by various routes. One of the important routes is contact of the human skin with the animal product, which is contaminated with the spores. The other route of transmission could be inhalation of the spores. This particularly is common in leather industry. While processing the leather, the spores are there on the leather and it gets aerosolized and you inhale them and you get infected. Another industry where the disease is common is wool industry. So while processing the wool which comes from sheep, you can get infected. Or the third route of transmission could be ingestion of a contaminated meat of the animal. Suppose the animal has died of anthrax and you unknowingly or unwittingly eat the meat of that dead animal. This happens in case of extreme starvation in tribal areas. And that's why you get so many reports emanating from the tribal areas of anthrax occurring in humans. And this happens in India also because of the extreme poverty. And people are forced to eat, especially in tribal areas, the meat of a dead animal, which unwittingly you eat it and you don't realize that the animal has already died of anthrax. Okay. Now, any of the routes, if the infection occurs, there is no further human-to-human spread. So there is no person-to-person spread per se in anthrax. So always remember, if I get infected with anthrax, I cannot transmit the disease efficiently to another person. Largely, it is an occupational disease, as you would realize, people who regularly come in contact with the animals. The organism can also be weaponized and can be used as a bioterrorist. Touch upon this a bit later. Now, we'll cover all the three clinical varieties of anthrax, starting with the cutaneous anthrax. Cutaneous anthrax, as I said, it occurs due to contact with the animal hide, or it can occur due to you carrying the animal hide on your back. The hide or the leather is contaminated. Due to the scratches, the spores get into the skin. This is the most common clinical form of anthrax naturally. 95% of the cases of anthrax actually are cutaneous anthrax. And the entry of the spore, as I said earlier, occurs due to the aberration. This disease is also referred to as hide porter's disease. So people who carry the animal hides on their back, they are very commonly get infected with this disease. The disease is also known by another name. It is also referred to as malignant pustule. But please keep this in mind. Both the words actually are misnomers. It is not a malignant disease. The meaning of the word malignant is If it is a cancerous, so it is nothing to do with that malignancy. Malignant means it is severe. Okay, that's fine. But this is kind of a misnomer. And a pustule. So it is neither a pustule. So malignant pustule, actually, both of these words are kind of misnomers, but the set of words have become so common that we continue to use them. So it starts as an itchy papule, which converts into a vesicle, and this then breaks and then converts into a painless ulcer, which blackens. And that's another reason why we call it as anthrax. You get black colored necrotic area at the site of the initial infection on the skin. And this is also referred to as an eschar, black colored scab. We were discussing in rickettsia also last time. So any black colored scab which is formed is referred to as an eschar. 20% mortality is seen in untreated cases. So in untreated cases, mortality is about 20%. Okay. So this is just to show you a clinical picture of cutaneous anthrax. You can see this central area which is all necrosed and it has become black in color and surrounded by an erythematous border. This is a classical lesion that you get with cutaneous anthrax. And please remember, it is a painless lesion unless you get secondary bacterial infection by some other bacterium. It's usually a painless lesion that you get. Okay. The second form of anthrax is perhaps the most dangerous one because if you don't treat this form of anthrax, it is almost always fatal. And this is inhalational anthrax. This is also referred to as pulmonary anthrax because it involves the lungs. And it is also known by another name. It is also referred to as wool sorter's disease. So it occurs in people who are working in wool industry while processing the wool. If the wool is contaminated with the spores, it will come into the air and you might inhale it and then they'll develop the disease. So as I said, the infection occurs due to inhalation of spores. The disease starts initially as non-specific illness in the form of fever, chills, cough, and chest pain. And quickly, it becomes a very severe disease with difficulty in breathing, tachypnea, that is faster rate of respiration, and shock. The person goes into sepsis and dies because of shock. The classical manifestation that you find on autopsy is hemorrhagic mediastinitis. So you get the lesions in the mediastinum, and it has got virtually 100% mortality rate. If it is not treated in time, it is almost always fatal. This is to show you the chest X-ray of a patient with pulmonary anthrax. There is widening of the mediastinal shadow. That's a classical picture that you get. So the mediastinal shadow is widened over here. And this is because of the multiplication and the lesion produced by bacterium in the mediastinum. The third form of anthrax is a rare entity, but as I said, it is still reported in our country, especially in the deprived parts of our country, in tribal areas of our country, intestinal anthrax. As I said earlier, it is due to the ingestion of meat of the animal which has already died of anthrax. And the disease manifests in the form of nausea, vomiting, fever, abdominal pain, and bloody diarrhea. And the classical manifestation, if you find on autopsy, do the autopsy, a person who's died of intestinal anthrax is hemorrhagic lymphadenitis. And the ulceration of the intestinal mucosa is what you get. And mortality is again higher than that of cutaneous anthrax, but lesser than that of pulmonary anthrax, about 25 to 60% in untreated cases. Now let's talk about the laboratory diagnosis of anthrax. Depending upon the site of infection, your laboratory diagnosis and the specimen collection will be based on that. So obviously, if it is a cutaneous anthrax, you will collect the vesicle fluid if the vesicle is still intact. Or if the vesicle is ruptured and you now have an eschar, so you will collect the fluid from underneath the eschar. You try to scrape it off and then collect the fluid from underneath the eschar. In inhalational anthrax, obviously no prize just for guessing. You collect a sputum sample. Inhalational anthrax is also commonly associated with sepsis, so you also collect a blood sample for culture. Intestinal anthrax, you commonly collect a peritoneal fluid. You do a peritoneal tap. That is, you put a needle through the abdominal wall into the peritoneal cavity and you collect the fluid, and you also collect a fecal sample. Though it is not that very rewarding, peritoneal fluid is a better sample to be collected. You can directly demonstrate the organism. A lot of questions that are asked in your entrance exams. You get pictures, especially in your NEET exam. So therefore, you need to be familiar with how the organism looks. You will never get this organism in your exam, obviously, because it is so dangerous to handle. But then pictures definitely can be given, so you need to be ready for this. On gram stain, you find chains of gram-positive bacilli, and these chains of gram-positive bacilli have got squared ends. So it is perfect rectangle that you get, and this is referred to as having a boxcar appearance or a bamboo stick appearance. So this is a question: boxcar appearance or a bamboo stick appearance is seen with. I'll just show you the picture just a few moments from now. And these are chains of bacilli, perfect rectangles, having a boxcar or a bamboo stick appearance. Boxcar means beta chains of freight car. मालगाड़ी का डब्बा ट्रेन का जो होता है, so box car वो मतलब होता है, it is like a box, it's a freight car, so chains of freight car. You can do a McFadden's reaction. McFadden's reaction, we use a stain called as polychrome methylene blue. Because this organism has got a peptide capsule, it gives you a polychrome staining where the capsule appears purplish in color. So I'll just show you the picture. On the top left corner, you see the chains of bacilli. This is referred to as having a boxcar appearance or a bamboo stick appearance. Again, you see the chains of bacilli. Okay, and this is on the bottom, you see the McFadden stain. You see the bacillus which has been stained, and around it is a violet halo around it. This violet halo is created by the staining of the capsule by polychrome methylene blue or McFadden stain. That's a classical picture that you see. Once you see it, you'll never be able to forget it. So all these are pictorial questions that you might get in your exams. You have to be ready for this. Okay. You can very easily culture this organism. 37 degrees centigrade, it will grow in any simple medium like nutrient agar. The colonies that you get on nutrient agar, they've got a hazy appearance. So this is referred to as having a frosted glass appearance. I have not written it over here. So classical appearance that you get is a frosted glass appearance. If you make the do the microscopy of the edges of the colony, you find these chains of bacilli on microscopy, and this is referred to as having a Medusa head colony. Medusa head is named after a Greek god who had long hair. So likened to that, it is referred to as Medusa head colony. If you do a culture in gelatin medium, so you get colonies which are referred to as having an inverted fir tree appearance. Just give me a moment, I'm going to explain what is inverted fir tree. On blood agar, you get non-hemolytic colonies. I had explained earlier, non-hemolytic colonies you get, it is an exception. Most of the bacillus other than anthracis produce hemolytic colonies. If you want to use a selective medium for isolation of this organism, especially if you are going to culture samples which might be contaminated with other organisms, we use this medium. Again, a question in your exams, PLET medium. PLET is an acronym basically, which stands for polymyxin B, lysozyme, EDTA, thallus acetate. So it is polymyxin B, lysozyme, EDTA, thallus acetate. Okay, so this medium helps in inhibiting other microorganisms, but it allows for the growth of this organism. You can also grow this organism on penicillin agar, where it shows a particular characteristic where penicillin, we all know, acts on the cell wall of the bacterium. So it damages the cell wall, and because of which the organism loses its shape. Remember, the shape of a bacterium is a function of its cell wall. So if the cell wall is damaged, the bacterium, instead of appearing bacillus in shape, appears spherical. So it is referred to as having a string of pearl appearance. So all these are questions beta in your exams that you need to know. Various newer techniques like polymerase chain reaction are also available, where you detect the DNA of the organism, but they are not very commonly performed. As I said earlier, we developed the first serological test in the history of microbiology, history of infectious diseases, was Ascoli's thermoprecipitin test. It's an old test. Nobody does it nowadays. This test actually detects the antigen of the organism in the infected tissue by principle known as precipitation. So it's an antigen-antibody reaction where you detect the antigen of the organism in the infected tissue, particularly of the animal we used to use. But this test is no longer used, but it might still be asked as a question, especially the older examiners. Okay. This is just to show you the colonies on blood agar. These are non-hemolytic colonies, you can see, and they've got a hazy appeal to them. So it is referred to as having a frosted glass appearance. This is the edge of the colony I was talking about. So you see under a microscope, you can see these chains, these long locks like snakes, as you can see, and it is likened to that. So that's why it is referred to as having a Medusa head appearance. This is a gelatin stab culture. You take gelatin medium, it is a solid, semi-solid medium, stab it with the organism. On the top part of the medium, you have more oxygen, so organism grows more. As you go to the bottom, the amount of organism which grows and gives you a hazy growth is less. So it gives you an appearance of an inverted fir tree. So that again is asked as a question, inverted fir tree appearance is seen. So I hope you got the point. How do you treat? Various antibiotics are available for treatment, like doxycycline and ciprofloxacin can be given for treatment. We also have monoclonal antibody preparation which neutralizes the toxin. This is called as raxibacumab. And this is a monoclonal antibody which is directed against the protective antigen of the anthrax bacillus. And this was approved by FDA in 2012 for treatment of cases of anthrax. So it's something new which has happened in terms of treatment. Okay, so I hope it is clear to you. How do you give a prophylaxis? So you've got Again, doxycycline or ciprofloxacin can also be given as prophylaxis. Suppose there are multiple cases happening and you want to basically give a prophylaxis before the case happens, so you can give the same drugs. We also have a vaccine available, but this is not for civilian use. This is only given for veterinarians and those people who are more likely to come in contact with this organism as part of their occupation, and military personnel. Why military personnel? Because this organism can be used as a bioterrorist weapon. Okay. As I said, but it is classified as a Class A bioterrorist weapon by U.S. Centers for Disease Control. U.S. Centers for Disease Control has classified bioterrorist agents in 3 classes, A, B, and C. And the most dreaded ones are the ones which belong to Class A. So Bacillus anthracis is one such agent. And there are others also. By and by, you will get to know. One other I'm going to discuss in fact, 2 other I'm going to discuss today itself. Because this organism can be grown easily and spores can be formulated very easily and can be aerosolized in the air, it can be used to terrorize people and to intentionally harm people. And also, we don't have an effective vaccine for civilian use. In fact, this happened in October 2001 in USA, when intentionally the spores were distributed through the US mail system, which led to 22 cases. 11 cases were of inhalational anthrax and 11 cases were of cutaneous anthrax, and fatality was about 45%. So this it was the latest known bioterrorist attack. And please remember, as a bioterrorist attack, you unusually get large number of cases of inhalational anthrax. Otherwise, inhalational anthrax is not so common. It is the cutaneous anthrax which is more common. So whenever you start to get large number of cases of inhalational anthrax in a particular area, you always immediately think in terms of a bioterrorist attack. Okay, so these were the actual letters that were sent to various senators of US to harm them and to also harm the postal system. Okay, and this was a person, Bruce Evans, was ultimately indicted in carrying out these attacks. It was just after the Twin Tower attacks, and this happened. So this was led to a lot of anxiety in people. Okay. Now we shift our attention to the second species of Bacillus, Bacillus cereus. Bacillus cereus, read the spelling over here, cereus, Cereus. So it is not S wala cereus. Okay, so we are not serious with an S. This cereus, Cereus, comes from the word cereal, Cereal. Cereal is the staple diet, and it is not that cereal, S wala cereal. So please remember this. So this cereal with a C gives you a lot of important ideas as to what this could be. So which we are going to come to a bit later. Organism is aerobe, spore forming. It is motile, unlike Bacillus anthracis, which is non-motile. It is non-capsulated. Again, unlike Bacillus anthracis. Again, on blood agar, unlike Bacillus anthracis, it produces beta hemolytic colony. Bacillus cereus is very widely distributed in the environment. It produces 2 virulence factors. One is an emetic toxin, which is heat stable, not easily destroyed by heating. And it is associated with nausea and vomiting. Just a minute. And the other one is an enterotoxin, which is a heat labile toxin, which is responsible for causing diarrhea. There are 2 types of foodborne infections you get with Bacillus cereus. We call it as a food poisoning. One is an emetic type and the other one is a diarrhea type. If you remember this table, most of your questions would be easily answered. A lot of questions you get in your exams. Emetic type, the incubation period is just 1 to 6 hours because it is a preformed heat-stable toxin that you consume. Because it is heat-stable, it is not inactivated upon heating of the food. Okay, and that's why the incubation period is less, just like staphylococcal food poisoning, if you remember. Whereas diarrhea type, the incubation period is intermediate between 8 to 16 hours. You require the multiplication of bacterium in the gut and then further elaboration of the toxin for the disease to happen. As we mentioned earlier, it is a heat-stable, preformed toxin, whereas diarrhea type is caused by heat labile toxin. Different serotypes of organism are responsible for different types of disease. I don't expect you to remember these, doesn't matter. The main symptom of emetic type, no prizes for guessing, the name is emetic, is obviously vomiting, whereas for diarrhea type, obviously it is diarrhea. I mean, nobody's going to ask this question from you. Even if you get it wrong, then even if, I mean, in spite of this, if you get it wrong, then God be with you. The most important food which is implicated is fried rice in case of emetic toxin, and diarrhea type, it is poultry, meat, and mashed potatoes. Now, you get a classical question on this. So, fried rice may be normally contaminated with the spores of the organism. If you don't eat the fried rice in one go, and I don't know how will this happen. You generally eat all the fried rice that you get. So if it is left over the Chinese fried rice, you keep it at the room temperature. The spores are normally there. They germinate, and the toxin is elaborated. Now the next day or after a few hours, you reheat the fried rice and then eat it. When you reheat it, the vegetative cells will get killed, but the toxin will not get inactivated. So you directly are now eating the toxin, and within 6 hours you will get to know what will happen. You will start to have the symptoms of vomiting. Okay, so please remember this very important table. A lot of questions can be answered if you remember this. Now, what are the specimens that you like to collect for diagnosis? You collect samples like feces, vomiters, food. The selective medium for isolation of this organism from non-sterile samples is MYP agar, which stands for mannitol egg yolk polymyxin B agar, and you get beta hemolytic colonies on blood agar. Both these diseases are usually self-limiting disease, and the person usually recovers on its own. So these are foodborne illnesses that you need to remember. I've just mentioned it for completion's sake. Strictly speaking, we can't call them as zoonoses. Okay, so zoonosis is anthrax. So this is a foodborne infection. I wanted to complete it over here itself so that we complete one holistic topic over here. But don't confuse it with anthrax. Now we'll shift our attention to another classical zoonosis, that is Yersinia. Yersinia, please remember, is a member of Enterobacteriaceae. It is a member of Enterobacteriaceae. The same organisms that you've covered, like E. coli, Salmonella, Shigella, Klebsiella. Okay, and the most important member of Yersinia is Yersinia pestis, the most dreaded bacterium in terms of severity of disease. I'll talk about the historical aspect also as we move along. So it's a gram-negative bacillus, just like Enterobacteriaceae. Other members of Enterobacteriaceae, it is aerobe or facultative anaerobe. This organism particularly is non-motile, non-sporing, and it also has got a capsule. And as somebody mentioned earlier, just like anthrax, it also has got a polypeptide capsule. So these are the two bacteria which are exceptional in having polypeptide capsules. The organism is facultative intracellular. Now, what do you mean by facultative intracellular? Please try to compare it with obligate intracellular. Day before yesterday, we talked about rickettsia, which is obligate intracellular. Obligate intracellular का मतलब होता है कोई भी बैक्टीरियम जो सेल के बाहर नहीं ग्रो कर सकता. It can only multiply within a live cell. And such bacteria called as obligate intracellular. We discussed some of them day before yesterday. Rickettsia is a classical example of obligate intracellular. Now, facultative intracellular means the organism can multiply both outside the cell and within the cell. Hence, facultative intracellular pathogens you can grow on artificial media, like blood agar, this agar, that agar. But none of the obligate intracellular bacteria you can grow on an artificial medium. So please remember this important fact. Another important fact that you need to remember in pathogenesis is that facultative intracellular bacterium, though can be grown in lab in an artificial medium or a cell-free medium, in the body when they cause the infection, they usually multiply within the cell of your body. The reason is pretty simple. They protect themselves from the immune system of the host. And one way to do that is to enter the cell of the host. If you do that, then you are totally protected against the humoral immune response. So this is a virulence mechanism of these organisms. So in vivo, generally, they go and hide and multiply inside the host cell. However, having said that, this is not an absolute requirement. Therefore, you can grow these organisms on artificial media. So many other examples of facultative intracellular bacteria I'm going to discuss today itself. In fact, there are many more that will be covered elsewhere. So I hope you've understood this important concept. No problems? Okay, Adiba, I'm going to explain. The second point is that facultative intracellular means they can grow both inside and outside the cell. But when they cause infection in the human, they tend to multiply inside the cell. By multiplying inside the cell, they protect themselves from the humoral immune response. So this is a survival mechanism for them to be able to protect from humoral immune response. So thereby, they are there inside the cell, though you can grow them on an artificial medium in the lab. I hope you've got the point. Now, what are the virulence factors for Yersinia pestis? It has got a type 3 secretion system. Now, what is the type 3 secretion system? In a very simple term, it's like a injection, molecular injection. So the bacterium attaches to the host cell and puts in a syringe and a needle, or I should say the needle of a syringe, and injects the toxins directly inside the host cell. And these toxins then eventually cause the damage of the cell. So these toxins include plasminogen activator, which prevents the clotting. F1 antigen is the protein capsule, which is antiphagocytic that we were discussing earlier. Plasmid mediated, so this is not injected. This is present on the surface of the cell. It is antiphagocytic. Then plasmid mediated V and W antigens, which are also considered to be antiphagocytic. And then we've got endotoxin, that is lipopolysaccharide, which it produces. So we've got a type 3 secretion system, which injects the toxin and takes over the host cell. Then the organism also produces a protease outside the cell. Again, this is not part of the secretion system. This prevents the clotting of the blood, and this helps in further spread of the infection, because if the clot is formed, then it leads to walling off of the lesion and does not allow the spread of infection, which by preventing the clotting, it helps in spread of infection. The rest I've already explained. Now, as I said, this also is a zoonotic infection. Yersinia pestis is worldwide in distribution. In the history of humankind, the severest pandemic ever to be recorded was plague caused by Yersinia pestis in the 14th century, 1300s. It is estimated that it killed 25% of the world population. So this was the only instance in the history of the world where the population of the world dipped. Never before and never after the population of the world has dipped. Now, put it in context with SARS-CoV pandemic. This is nothing in terms of mortality. 25% of the world population to die in a pandemic is something to really take notice of. Okay, so just to put in perspective, SARS-CoV-2 pandemic and this one. So 25% of the 1/4 of the world population was wiped out, and this led to the dip in the world population, and it has never happened since then. No dip in the world population. We're all happily reproducing, but we've never seen a dip in our human population before that or even after that. Now, there are two forms of plague, urban plague and sylvatic plague. Urban plague occurs in rats, and it is transmitted through rat fleas. Sylvatic plague is basically seen in forest, and this is seen in prairie dogs, squirrels, and their fleas. The infection is transmitted through rat flea from the rats in the urban area to the humans, and the scientific name is Brucella chopsis. We discussed one more disease transmitted through rat flea day before yesterday. I hope you remember that. Okay. Infection can also occur through inhalation of respiratory droplets. I'll explain this a bit later. Humans, however, are accidental hosts. Okay, and just like Bacillus anthracis, this is also classified as a Class A bioterrorist agent. So this can also be weaponized and used for ulterior motive to harm people intentionally. So this is a diagram which shows you the epidemiology. So flea maintains the infection with the rat in the urban area and with the squirrel and other rodents in the forest area. Humans, they venture into the near these areas, especially in the urban form of the plague. Flea bites and the infection occurs. The form which the human get is known as a bubonic plague. We'll discuss it. Bubonic plague can spread to the lungs. So the infection can locally multiply and then spread to the lungs. When it spreads to the lungs, it is called as a secondary pulmonary plague or secondary pneumonic plague. Now, from there, the person can expectorate it in the sputum, and the next person can get infected directly in the lungs. And this is then referred to as a primary pneumonic plague. Okay, so can you have person-to-person spread in plague? Quick answer, beta. Good, Pooja. Endemic typhus you mentioned. If I ask this question, can you have person-to-person transmission in plague? Good. Very few zoonotic infections have person-to-person transmission, beta. It is more of an exception rather than rule. Plague is one such example, and never forget it. Okay. Very, very few infections there is person-to-person spread. Okay. So let's see the pathogenesis. Initial multiplication occurs at the site of inoculation after the bite of the flea. Organism multiplies in the regional lymph nodes. Suppose it is the lower limb which is involved. Inguinal lymph nodes are involved, and the infection spreads through lymphatic system to the inguinal lymph nodes, and there the multiplication occurs and the necrosis of the lymph node occurs, and the size of the lymph node increases. And this is called as a bubo. That's why it is called as a bubonic plague. So the first plague to appear in any setting is always a bubonic plague, and then you get later forms of plague like pneumonic plague. Hematogenous spread can occur to other organs and tissues, particularly the lungs. Then it is called as a secondary pneumonic plague. The person with secondary pneumonic plague can set the organism in respiratory droplets, and the next person can get primary pneumonic plague. So I hope you've got the point. So one by one, we are going to cover these entities. Bubonic plague, as I said, occurs through flea bite. The incubation period is up to 7 to 8 days. The initial manifestation is high fever, chills, headache, myalgia, and then you get a painful bubo. If the bite of the flea occurs in the lower limb, you get inguinal lymphadenopathy, painful. If the bite occurs on the arm or on the hand, then obviously the axillary lymph nodes are involved. So this depends upon where the bite has occurred. Quickly, the organism may spread in some cases. Purna, you'll never get a bubo in primary pneumonic plague because it's a primary site of infection is the lung. Absolutely right. Good. So in some cases, the infection can spread beyond the buboes and involve the blood and can lead to sepsis, a septic shock. Okay, and in extreme cases, because of this sepsis, there is damage to the blood vessels supplying the lower limbs or extremities, and this leads to necrosis of the extremities. And that's why the name was given to it, Black Death. So that's why the name came Black Death. Okay, mortality is about 50%. This is just to show you the inguinal lymphadenopathy occurring in a person having bubonic plague. You can see the raised lesion. This is nothing but the inflamed, painful inguinal lymph node. Okay. Pneumonic plague, as I said, is primary or secondary, and I've explained you the meaning. Primary pneumonic plague has got the shortest incubation period, just about 3 days. So this is a question that you get in exams. Which clinical form of plague has got the shortest incubation period? Always remember it is primary pneumonic plague. This leads to hemorrhagic pneumonia, and mortality is 90%. Even if you do everything, mortality is still extremely high. The only way you can save the life of the person is to start the treatment as early as possible, which in most of the cases might not be possible. Okay. Again, a question: which form of plague has got the highest mortality or the shortest incubation period? All these are questions get in your exam. Now, how do you perform the diagnosis? Diagnosis is by direct microscopy. You can do the Wason stain. On Wason stain, this is of the blood smear. You can see bipolar staining. That's a classical appearance. It is called as a safety pin appearance. The ends of the bacilli are strongly stained than the middle part of the bacterium. So this is repetitive. I hope you can see the slide. Bipolar staining. So this is you get as a picture in your exams. You need to know. Okay. You can culture the organism very easily, and we can also do serology. We can demonstrate the antibody against the F1 antigen, and also ELISA tests are also available for serology. Treatment is done by streptomycin is considered to be the drug of choice. Other drugs that can be given or antibiotics that can be given for treatment are gentamicin or doxycycline. One more point I want to mention, stalactite growth is seen with. Now, what is a stalactite growth? You take a liquid medium and overlay with oil, and then you inoculate the organism. So when you inoculate the organism, the growth hangs from the layer of oil into the medium, and this is known as stalactite growth. Okay, so stalactite growth is seen with. And please don't confuse stalactite growth with satellitism. So we are going to learn about satellitism in Haemophilus influenza. There's a common, actually because of the similar sounding words, you get confused between the two. So stalactite growth, if the question comes, your answer is Yersinia pestis. If satellitism is a question, this will be taught to you, if not yet taught, in Haemophilus influenza. In Haemophilus influenza. Okay, in Haemophilus influenza. So now we come to the next organism, that is Brucella. So Brucella is the next organism that we're going to talk about. It's a pathogen of animals again, obviously that's what we are discussing. It's a gram-negative Coccobacillus. Gram-negative Coccobacillus. Obligate aerobe. Everything is non about it. Non-motile, non-capsulated, non-sporing. It is fastidious. It has a growth requirement which are fastidious. And again, it is facultative intracellular. Now you understand the word facultative intracellular. These organisms have multiple species: Brucella abortus, Brucella militensis, Brucella sui, and canis. And the name of the species, actually, you can link it with a particular animal in which it basically causes the infection. Brucella abortus causes the infection in cattle. Militensis causes disease in sheep and goat. Sui se pata chal jayega, it basically causes infection in swine. And Brucella canis, as the name says, canis, in canines like dogs. Okay, so each of these 4 species are associated with disease in typical animal. Okay, and from that animal you get the infection. Brucellosis is the disease caused by this organism. And this brucellosis is known by various other names, and all of these are questions. Malta fever, undulant fever, Mediterranean fever, Banks disease, all these are questions in your exams. All of these are synonyms. Malta fever is caused by, undulant fever is caused by, Mediterranean fever is caused by, Banks disease is caused by. Please don't confuse Mediterranean fever with Mediterranean spotted fever. Mediterranean spotted fever is basically caused by Rickettsia conori, Indian tick typhus. So please don't confuse between the two. Mediterranean fever is separate. Mediterranean spotted fever is separate. So because it all sounds the same, that's why please remember this. Now, what is epidemiology? It's basically causing a chronic lifelong infection in animals. So basically, it is a disease of animals, and I've just mentioned the typical animals. And it is shed in very large numbers in the milk of the animal or urine and placenta of the animal. And in the animals, it particularly is associated with sterility and abortion. Okay, otherwise, not much of manifestation occurs in these animals. So they are efficient sources of infection. Now, how does the infection get transmitted to the humans? It is by ingestion of unpasteurized milk of the animal. So if you drink the unpasteurized milk of the animal, you get infected. It is either or through the inhalation. So if the organism is in aerosols, by disturbing the soil, you can get infected, or through direct inoculation. That is, while handling the animal, you can get injured. Particularly, this happens in people who are working in abattoirs. So they're cutting the meat for the animal, and animal is infected. You get the cut due to injury. You get the infection. So 3 I's, remember: ingestion, inhalation, inoculation. And please remember, there is no I by the name of insect. It is not an insect-borne disease. Okay, always remember this. That's why the disease is common in particular professions like veterinarians, butchers, and animal handlers. Veterinarians, butchers, animal handlers. And as I said, there is no person-to-person spread. So if I get brucellosis, I cannot efficiently transmit it to others, unlike plague, where the infection can be transmitted from one person to the other person. Here, there is no person-to-person spread. So just a pictorial representation. So unpasteurized cheese or other foodstuff that you eat, or ingestion, inoculation, these are the animals. You get infected. There is no further person-to-person spread. Okay, ordinarily. Now, what is the pathogenesis? Upon entry from any of these routes, the organism is transmitted by the lymphatic vessel to the regional lymph nodes. In the regional lymph nodes, the organism multiplies within the monocytes and macrophages. And from there, there is a hematogenous spread through the monocytes and macrophages to various other organs like liver, spleen, kidneys, bone marrow. Okay, and there is also a predilection for placenta. If it is a pregnant animal, it particularly infects the placenta, and one of the theory behind it is that placenta is rich in a sugar called as erythritol, which this organism loves. So that's why it causes a selective infection of the placenta in animals, and that's why it leads to abortion in the female animals, like in goat, sheep, and all. Okay. Now, what is the clinical manifestation in humans? The incubation period is very, very wide, ranging from about 5 days to several months. Most of the infections are subclinical infections. You don't even come to know that you are infected. While infection, when it occurs symptomatically, it is divided into 2 categories: acute and chronic. Acute infection manifests in the form of fever, malaise, sweats, anorexia, and you get waves of fever, which is referred to as undulant fever. Okay, so you get fever, then you get okay, then you again get fever. So that's why it is referred to as undulating fever. That's another name for this disease. Chronic infection, actually, the manifestations get even more vague. So you get very low-grade infection, and you get night sweats. You get symptoms like depression. Okay, night sweats. You get a lot of malaise, anorexia. Very, very non-specific symptoms. Even more non-specific than acute infection. And many of these cases actually are misdiagnosed as psychiatric illnesses. And for years together, they receive treatment for psychiatric illness. Okay, so we always need to have a very strong index of suspicion to diagnose brucellosis. That's why the occupational history is extremely, extremely important. You have to be an extremely good clinician and infectious disease practitioner to be able to diagnose brucellosis. Okay, you only when you know about this disease, you will think about it. Only when you think about it, you will make it as a differential diagnosis and search for it. Otherwise, most of these people actually get wrong treatment. That's why I said detailed history, occupational history, exposure to animal, travel history is very, very important to think about, to even think about this disease. You can do blood culture in acute brucellosis. Chronic brucellosis blood culture is usually negative, not much of a value. So acute brucellosis, it is of value. However, even then it is poorly sensitive. Use a special medium. Again, we ask this as a question, show as a spot to you. This is a biphasic culture medium. which is also referred to as Castaneda's method. So you see over here, Castaneda's method. So in which this is a biphasic medium, you've got a solid medium and a liquid medium. You inoculate the blood in the liquid part, incubate it. When you want to subculture it, just tilt the bottle, and the colonies, if the organism is there, it will seed the surface, and then you again straighten the bottle. And when you incubate it, the surface of the solid medium, which is above the level of the liquid medium, the colonies would grow, and you will be able to see. The beauty of this medium is that you don't have to open the bottle to culture the organism, because it is highly infectious for the laboratory personnel to be handling this. So therefore, in a closed system, once you inoculate the bottle, you can amplify it in the broth and then do the culture on a solid medium in the same bottle. And this is a question that you get in your exams. Castaneda's method is used for. What is Castaneda's method? You get a picture also, and then you have to answer. That's why blood culture is not of much value other than in acute brucellosis you can try. Serology is of main value. Various serological tests are available, like standard agglutination test, which is in short referred to as SAT. Standard agglutination test, please remember, detects mainly IgM class of antibodies. And because it detects IgM class of antibody, it is particularly useful for diagnosing acute brucellosis. And then we've got complement fixation test and 2-mercaptoethanol test. Complement fixation test can detect both IgM and IgG class of antibodies, while 2-mercaptoethanol test only detects specific IgG antibodies. 2-mercaptoethanol test therefore is more useful for diagnosing chronic brucellosis, where you get IgG response. Okay. So if the question is asked, standard agglutination test is helpful in making diagnosis of, please remember, acute brucellosis. 2-mercaptoethanol test is more useful for making diagnosis of chronic brucellosis. How do you treat brucellosis? Long-term treatment has to be given for months together, and a combination therapy is given. Doxycycline with streptomycin is usually given for treatment. And prevention of this disease used to be very common in old days when we did not know the pathogenesis and its mode of transmission. By simply pasteurizing the daily products, we can actually prevent the transmission. And that's why the prevalence of the disease drastically went down. It drastically went down due to the adoption of universal pasteurization of milk. And that's why we always say never drink unpasteurized raw milk. There are many diseases which can be transmitted, including brucellosis. So this is just to show you the colonies of Brucella. When you grow it on blood culture and then subsequently grow on blood agar, you get these tiny colonies, and this is the gram stain. You tiny Coccobacilli are seen, gram-negative Coccobacilli. Okay. Then we come to Francisella tularensis, the next bacterium. Francisella tularensis again is a zoonosis. Just like brucellosis, it is a gram-negative Coccobacillus. It's a facultative anaerobe. Brucella was a strict aerobe. Non-motile, it is capsulated. It has got a polysaccharide capsule. Non-sporing, and just like Brucella, it is also fastidious. Just like Yersinia and Brucella, this organism is also facultative intracellular. Just like Bacillus anthracis as well as Yersinia pestis, it is also a class A bioterrorist agent. In fact, I've mentioned 3 class A bioterrorist agents today itself: Bacillus anthracis, then we have Yersinia pestis, then Francisella tularensis, and then there are 3 more. These are Clostridium botulinum, then we've got Clostridium botulinum, then we've got smallpox, and lastly we've got Ebola virus. So these are 6 class A bioterrorist agents, but 3 together we've covered actually 3 today. What is the epidemiology? The disease which is caused by Francisella tularensis is called as tularemia. It is also known by various other names. It is also called as rabbit fever or a deer fly fever. Rabbit fever or a deer fly. We'll try to justify these names. The disease was first identified in Tulare County, which is there in California and US. And that's why it is called as tularemia. The disease is normally found in wild animals and birds. And the insect vectors can transmit this infection. They involve large array of insect vectors like heart ticks, lice, and mice. Between these animals and these, the infection is transmitted to these insect vectors. But the most important insect vector for human infection is not lice or mice, it is heart tick. So if the question is asked, what is the vector for transmission? For tularemia, it is heart tick. Please remember this. Infection, however, can also be transmitted by other routes like ingestion of contaminated meat of the animal and inhalation of aerosols. While you are handling infected animal, aerosols are generated, you can get infected. And that's why the disease occurs in veterinarians, hunters, livestock workers, meat handlers. These are the people, just like brucellosis. Just like brucellosis, there is no person-to-person spread in tularemia. Okay, if you get infected, you cannot transmit to another person. This organism is perhaps the most infectious of all infectious agents, highly infectious in terms of bacteria. Okay, even 10 organisms actually can cause infection, as low as 10 organisms. The organism, once it infects, it initially multiplies locally and then it spreads through the lesional lymph nodes. And just like brucellosis, the infection from the local lymph nodes spreads through the monocytes and macrophages to various other parts of the body like skin, lungs, liver, spleen, CNS. A disseminated infection can occur. Now, what are the clinical forms of tularemia? The clinical forms of tularemia largely depend upon the initial site of infection. Very simple to understand. If you get infected by the tick bite, you get the ulcer at the bite of the bite, at the site of the bite, where the organism multiplies, and this is associated with localized regional lymphadenopathy. And this disease is called as ulceroglandular form. This is referred to as an ulceroglandular form. Is referred to as an ulceroglandular form. Okay, ulceroglandular form. So, which is the most common clinical form of tularemia? Please remember it is ulceroglandular. If you understand the pathogenesis, you'll never forget it. Okay. The other form is that if the conjunctiva get infected, suppose you're handling the animal and your eyes get contaminated, you get conjunctivitis and there's involvement of the local lymph node, and this is called as an oculoglandular form. Sometimes you can get a pharyngeal infection, especially upon ingestion of contaminated meat of the animal. This is called a pharyngeal form. If you inhale the organism, you get the involvement of the lung, and this is called as a pneumonic form. Sometimes there is no localized manifestation. There is no localized manifestation, you just get fever, and this resembles typhoid. So the organism most probably, by any of these routes you get infected, most probably through ingestion or maybe through inhalation. The organism then does not produce any localized symptom. Instead, it spreads into the blood and then you get fever, and this is called as a typhoidal form. So these are the various clinical forms of tularemia. Please remember the question, which is the most common clinical form of tularemia? Our answer would be ulceroglandular form. This is a picture of the ulceroglandular form at the site of infection with the bite of the heart tick. Organism multiplies and you get an ulcer, and there is a localized regional lymphadenopathy which is not obviously visible in this picture. You can culture the organism for diagnosis. Culture the organism from the ulcer scrapings or lymph node biopsies or sputum in case of pneumonia. The organism requires two nutritional factors for growth that you need to remember. And this again is a question: iron and cysteine. And the medium which is used for its growth is called as Francis blood dextrocysteine agar. You get tiny translucent colonies. Okay. The drug of choice is either you can give streptomycin or gentamicin or tetracycline for treatment. So just to show you that's how it appears in the gram stain of the colony. You get these colonies and the treatment is written. Lastly, we come to Pasteurella multocida. Just one slide and then we'll cover some questions. This again is a gram-negative Bacillus. It is a facultative anaerobe. The organism is actually normally found in the oral cavity, and the infection therefore occurs after a dog or a cat bite. And after a dog or a cat bite, you get a fulminant disease. Within a day or two, you get acute painful cellulitis at the site of inoculation within 24 hours of animal bite. And if it is near a bone, you can also get complications in the form of osteomyelitis. So whenever you get an acute history after a dog or a cat bite, within a day there is purulent discharge, there is angry lesion. You immediately think in terms of Pasteurella multocida. So that's a clinical marker that you have to think in terms of. Immediately you have to treat this illness. You have to irrigate the wound. Do the wound debridement, dead vital tissue you will remove, and the drug of choice for treatment is penicillin G. Is a drug of choice for treatment. We'll cover some questions at the end, and let's see whether you're able to answer or not. Which form of anthrax has the poorest prognosis? Hyde-Porter's disease, malignant pustule, Wool-Sorter's disease, intestinal anthrax. Quick answers, beta. Which form of anthrax has got the worst prognosis? Very good. Kartike ने गलत बोला बेटा. It is Wool-Sorter's disease. Wool-Sorter's disease is the other name for pulmonary anthrax. So very high mortality seen with pulmonary anthrax. Hyde-Porter's disease and malignant pustule is the same thing. Cutaneous anthrax. It has got the least severe disease. Intestinal anthrax has got intermediate severity as compared to pulmonary anthrax or cutaneous anthrax. So you're right. Answer. Most of you are right except Kartike got the answer correct now. So it is C. Wool-Sorter's disease or pulmonary anthrax. What is the chest X-ray finding on pulmonary anthrax? Quick answer. क्या मिलता है chest X-ray में बेटा? Hemorrhagic mediastinitis होता है तो क्या होगा? Widening of the mediastinal shadow. You get classical picture. Which of the following zoonotic illness has no arthropod vector? Plague, brucellosis, tularemia, epidemic typhus. Quick answer. Which of the following zoonotic infection does not have an arthropod vector? बताओ बेटा. प्लेग का आर्थ्रोपोड वेक्टर है बेटा. व्हाट इज अ वेक्टर? इट इज रैट फ्ली. टुलरेमिया का बिना वेक्टर के भी हो सकता है, विदाउट वेक्टर भी हो सकता है, बट वेक्टर से होता है तो इट इज हार्ट टिक. एपिडेमिक टाइफस, yesterday we talked about what is the vector for epidemic typhus. Day before yesterday we covered. It is body louse. So what is left? Brucellosis. 3 routes of transmission of brucellosis: ingestion, inhalation, inoculation. Which I is not there? मैंने क्या बताया था? Ingestion, inoculation, inhalation. Which I is not there in brucellosis? Insect is not there. Good. Very good. 3. Which of the following food product is most probable vehicle for transmission of brucellosis? Unpasteurized goat cheese, rare hamburger, fresh orange juice, fried rice. Quick answer बड़ा आसान है बेटा. Unpasteurized dairy products are the main sources of infection. Okay? For brucellosis. Fried rice किसका है बेटा? अभी हमने डिस्कस किया था. Fried rice किसका है? Fried rice. So you consume Chinese fried rice, within 6 hours you get severe vomiting. You talk in terms of emetic type of food poisoning caused by Bacillus cereus. Emetic type of food poisoning. Okay. What is the incubation period? Within 6 hours. Okay. हमने स्टेफाइलोकोकल फूड पॉइजनिंग भी शायद करी थी. स्टेफाइलोकोकल फूड पॉइजनिंग के अंदर मिल्क प्रोडक्ट होता है, वो भी प्रीफॉर्म्ड होता है. इंक्यूबेशन पीरियड देयर इज आल्सो लेस देन 6 hours and again you get vomiting. So whenever you get a question on fried rice and vomiting within 6 hours, think in terms of Bacillus cereus. When you get vomiting after consuming milk product within 6 hours vomiting, think in terms of Staph aureus. Question number 4. 4 days after handling a dead rabbit, a game warden developed painful ulcer on the right index finger with right axillary lymphadenopathy. The patient is most likely infected with Yersinia pestis, Brucella bovis, Francisella tularensis, Pasteurella multocida. ये तो अभी हमने डिस्कस किया बेटा. रैबिट को हैंडल किया, उसके बाद वो इन्फेक्ट हो गया, अल्सर हो गया फिंगर पे, फिर एक्सिलरी लिम्फेडेनोपैथी. सो दिस इज अ क्लासिकल फीचर ऑफ विच फॉर्म ऑफ डिजीज? Classical feature of which form of disease? It is ulceroglandular form of tularemia. Ulceroglandular form of tularemia. Very good. Most of you have answered it correctly. C. ठीक है. राजश्री ने गलत कर दिया. Please, I hope you will get it right now. ठीक है. So it is Francisella tularensis. Good. Last question. An 8-year-old boy is bitten by a stray cat. 2 days later, the wound was red and swollen and drained purulent fluid. The patient is most likely infected with. Straightforward question, beta. Yersinia pestis, Brucella bovis, Francisella tularensis, Pasteurella multocida. क्या आंसर होगा बेटा? So you get a history of a dog or a cat bite. Within a day, there is inflamed swelling, which basically breaks. You get a purulent discharge. You also have osteomyelitis. The person, in fact, can also go into sepsis. So that's a very severe complication, and that's a classical manifestation of Pasteurella multocida. Pasteurella multocida. Okay, good. Most of you have got this right. Good. In fact, all of you have got this right. So with this, we are through with this session. I hope the session was useful for you. I've tried to put in some clinical context also, so that you actually relate with the clinical condition rather than only learning about microbiology. So I hope the session was useful for you. Any questions if you have, we can take it for a couple of minutes. Otherwise, we'll close the session. Is that okay, beta? Shall we close? No questions? Thank you very much, beta. Thank you.